The rain drummed against the massive windows of the 35th floor when Richard Montgomery adjusted his tie, knot, and smiled with disdain. Do you really think someone like you belongs in the same space as international investors? The words cut through the air of the luxurious lobby like sharp blades. Look at yourself. Soaked, dirty, carrying that stinking backpack like a vagrant. Michael Sanders kept his head high, raindrops still trickling down his dark hair, his brown eyes gleaming with a dignity that Richard couldn't comprehend. In his hands, he held a sealed envelope, documents that would change everything, if only he knew what was about to unfold. "Sir, you don't know me," Michael responded with a calm, almost whispered voice. "You know nothing about me." Richard burst into laughter, a shrill sound that echoed through the Italian marble floors. The foreign investors beside him exchanged uncomfortable glances, but soon joined in nervous laughter, feeding the businessman's ego. "I know exactly what you are, kid. A failed delivery driver who couldn't even stay dry." Richard threw a $100 bill on the wet floor. "Take that and get out. It's more than you'll earn today." What Richard Montgomery couldn't imagine was that in less than an hour, his life of luxury and arrogance would collapse completely, and the man he had just humiliated would become responsible for teaching him the most expensive lesson of his existence. But to understand how we arrived at this moment of brutal confrontation, we need to go back 6 months in time. Richard Montgomery, at 52, was what economic newspapers called the king of the real estate market. His hands had shaped the city's skyline through decades of predatory deals, transforming entire neighborhoods into gleaming commercial centers, while small business owners watched their dreams be demolished along with their establishments. Sitting in his 2-story penthouse in the Montgomery Tower building, Richard contemplated the city through French windows that cost more than many houses. The apartment was a temple to his own ego, walls covered by European master paintings, authentic Greek sculptures strategically positioned, and a climate-controlled wine cellar with decades-old wines he had never tasted, but displayed as trophies of superiority. "Maria, bring the monthly report," he ordered his personal secretary, a middle-aged woman who had worked for him for 15 years and still trembled in his presence. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery." Maria carefully placed a leather folder on the black marble table. October's numbers were exceptional. The acquisition of Sanders Engineering yielded the perfect land for the new shopping center. A predatory smile spread across Richard's tanned face. Sanders Engineering had been a promising environmental technology company, founded by a visionary who died too young, leaving his son Michael as heir to a dream that Richard crushed without remorse. The forced purchase and immediate closure of the company yielded land valued at $20 million, where he now erected another monument to consumption. "How many employees were laid off?" Richard asked, flipping through financial reports. 203, sir, including some engineers who had worked there for over a decade." "Perfect. That's how you do business, Maria. Sentimentality doesn't build empires." Richard closed the folder with a sharp snap. "And did those European investors confirm for today?" "Yes, sir. Dr. James Morrison from Ecotech Global and 5 other investors arrive at 3 in the afternoon. They're very interested in your proposals for the new financial district." Richard Montgomery had perfected the art of turning destruction into profit. Every demolished building, every evicted family, every closed small business converted into figures in his bank accounts. His philosophy was simple. The world belonged to the strong, the intelligent, those who had the courage to do what was necessary. The weak existed only to serve or get out of the way. In reality, behind the facade of relentless success, Richard hid a visceral fear that tormented him during lonely early mornings, the possibility of losing everything. Son of Spanish immigrants who worked their entire lives in a small grocery store, Richard grew up watching his parents bow before arrogant and authoritarian customers. He swore from childhood that he would never be humiliated like he saw his parents being daily. At 18, with a scholarship earned through exceptional grades and fierce determination, Richard graduated in administration and finance. His first jobs were in companies where he was constantly reminded of his humble origins by bosses from traditional families. Each humiliation was carefully filed in his memory, feeding a cold fury that drove him to work 18 hours a day. The turning point came at 28, when he discovered his boss was embezzling money from the company. Instead of reporting it, Richard blackmailed the man, forcing him to make him a partner. It was his first lesson about the true functioning of power. Information was worth more than honesty. Fear was more effective than respect. Now, decades later, Richard had built an empire based on the premise that he would never again be the weakest in the room. Every humiliation he inflicted on others was revenge against his own past, a way to convince himself that he had completely transcended his origins. The problem was that the greater his power grew, the greater became his terror of losing it. While Richard savored his limited edition Colombian coffee, 15 kilometers away, Michael Sanders adjusted his waterproof backpack and checked the GPS on his scratched cell phone. 3 more deliveries and he could go home, to the small apartment he shared with his widowed mother in the East Side neighborhood. At 28, Michael possessed the type of intelligence that university professors recognize immediately, a mind capable of seeing patterns where others see only chaos, of connecting apparently unconnected concepts into revolutionary solutions. Graduated in environmental engineering with honors from Columbia University, Michael had spent the first 5 years after graduation working at the company his father founded, Sanders Engineering. Sanders Engineering wasn't just a company for Michael. It was the living legacy of Edward Sanders, a brilliant inventor who died in a car accident when Michael was only 17. Edward had dedicated his life to developing clean technologies that could solve urban environmental problems, especially the energy issue of large metropolises. "Son," Edward used to say during the long nights they spent together in the improvised laboratory in the house's basement, "humanity has always found a way to turn trash into gold. Our generation will discover how to turn trash into energy." This phrase echoed in Michael's mind every morning when he put on the red uniform of the delivery company. 6 months ago, Richard Montgomery had forcibly bought Sanders Engineering through a legal maneuver that took advantage of debts contracted during the pandemic. In 48 hours, a company that took 15 years to build was demolished, its employees fired, and the land prepared for another real estate project. Michael could have sued, could have fought in the courts, but he didn't have the financial resources to face Richard's army of lawyers. Instead, he accepted the delivery job as a temporary measure, or so he thought. What he didn't imagine was that this experience would give him exactly what he needed to complete the invention that would change everything. During the first months as a delivery driver, Michael observed the city from a completely new perspective. Cycling through rich and poor neighborhoods, seeing up close how garbage accumulated in the peripheries while urban centers gleamed with wasted energy, an idea began to take shape in his brilliant mind. What if it were possible to create a system that transformed urban waste directly into electrical energy, without the expensive and inefficient intermediate processes of current technologies? What if each neighborhood could have its own mini-plant that converted local waste into energy for immediate consumption? Every night, after 12-hour journeys cycling through the city, Michael locked himself in his small room and opened the laptop he had bought in installments, equipment he had personally modified to have the processing capacity necessary for his complex simulations. There, surrounded by stacks of printed scientific articles and notebooks filled with handwritten calculations, he brought his father's vision to life. The waterproof backpack he carried during deliveries didn't contain only packages. Hidden in a special compartment he had sewn himself, Michael transported the fruit of months of obsessive research, miniature prototypes of his energy conversion system, technical documents detailing every aspect of the invention, and preliminary contracts that few people knew existed. Because Michael Sanders, the dirty and wet delivery driver that people saw cycling through the streets, had achieved something that the world's largest laboratories had been trying for decades. A technology capable of converting urban waste into clean energy with 300% superior efficiency to existing alternatives. It was on a sunny November morning that everything began to change. Michael was organizing the day's deliveries when he received a call he wasn't expecting. "Hello, Mr. Sanders. This is Dr. James Morrison from Ecotech Global. We received your preliminary documentation through Johnson & Associates Patents. We would like to schedule a meeting to discuss your technological proposal. Michael almost dropped the phone. 3 months earlier, he had sent an executive summary of his invention to several companies specializing in renewable energy, but had never received responses. GoTech Global was one of the largest multinationals in the sector, responsible for energy implementations in more than 40 countries. Dr. Morrison, Of course, when would be convenient for you? Actually, Mr. Sanders, I'll be in New York this afternoon for other business meetings. Would it be possible to meet at 4 o'clock? I'm staying at the hotel in the Montgomery Tower building. The name hit Michael like a punch to the stomach. Montgomery Tower. Richard Montgomery's building. The man who destroyed his father's company and threw 200 employees onto the street. But this could be the opportunity he had been waiting for months. Perfect, Dr. Morrison. I'll be there. Michael hung up the phone and looked at the backpack he carried every day. Inside were not only the prototypes and documents of his invention, but also contracts he had signed in secret with companies from 3 continents. His technology had already been patented in 12 countries, and licensing companies estimated that its commercial value exceeded $800 million. But at that moment, wearing the red uniform soaked with sweat, Michael Sanders was still just a delivery driver in the eyes of the world. In a few hours, in the lobby of the building belonging to the man who destroyed his life, this was about to change forever. At 3 in the afternoon, the 35th floor of Montgomery Tower buzzed with the energy of big business being discussed. Richard had transformed his meeting room into a theater of power. Polished mahogany table reflecting crystal lights, Italian leather chairs, and a panoramic view of the city that served as backdrop for his arrogant presentations. Dr. James Morrison, a tall man with graying hair and designer glasses, led the delegation of European investors. A world expert in renewable energy, Morrison had built his reputation identifying revolutionary technologies before they became mainstream. His company, GoTech Global, was responsible for some of the largest energy innovations of the last 2 decades. Mr. Montgomery, Morrison said with refined British accent, your proposals for the financial district are impressive, but we're primarily interested in projects with environmental sustainability components. Richard smiled confidently, though internally irritated by the condition. Sustainability always seemed like an unnecessary obstacle to profit. But he had learned to use the correct language with European investors. Dr. Morrison, I can guarantee that all my projects follow the most rigorous environmental standards. In fact, I recently acquired an environmental technology company precisely to incorporate innovations into our developments. What company was that? Morrison asked, genuinely interested. Sanders Engineering, a small local firm that developed some interesting technologies before. Facing financial difficulties, Morrison frowned. The name sounded familiar, but he couldn't identify why. He made a mental note to research later. The meeting continued with Richard presenting luxurious slides about his future developments, each promising astronomical returns and neutral environmental impact. The investors asked technical questions that Richard answered with eloquent evasions, demonstrating the type of superficial charm he had perfected over the years. While Richard seduced investors on the 35th floor, Michael pedaled against the growing wind through the city's central avenues. Dark clouds accumulated on the horizon, promising one of the typical New York summer storms. He had programmed his route to arrive at Montgomery Tower exactly at 4 o'clock. After completing his mandatory deliveries of the day, in his backpack, besides the usual prototypes, Michael carried a waterproof folder containing documents that could change his life. International licensing contracts, technical feasibility reports prepared by independent laboratories, and patent certifications that proved the originality and commercial potential of his invention. The rain began as sparse drops, but quickly intensified into a curtain of water that transformed the streets into improvised rivers. Michael adjusted his uniform hood and accelerated his pedaling, but knew he would arrive soaked at the most important meeting of his life. It doesn't matter, he murmured to himself, remembering his father's words. The value of an idea doesn't depend on the appearance of who presents it. It was 3:45, When Michael pushed through the revolving doors of Montgomery Tower, his clothes dripped on the Italian marble floor, leaving a trail of water that the security guards watched with disapproval. The lobby was a palace of ostentation. Baccarat crystal chandeliers, Greek sculptures, and walls lined with marble that cost more than many houses. "Excuse me," Michael addressed the reception desk, where a young woman in impeccable uniform watched him with poorly disguised disdain. "I have a 4 o'clock meeting with Dr. James Morrison." "I'm Michael Sanders." The receptionist checked the list with visible reluctance. "Dr. Morrison is on the 35th floor, but..." She looked Michael up and down. "Perhaps it would be better if you dried off before going up." It was at this moment that the panoramic elevator opened, and Richard Montgomery emerged accompanied by his foreign investors. The businessman was laughing at some private joke when his eyes met Michael standing in the center of the lobby, uniformed and soaked, carrying the backpack that dripped on the immaculate floor. Richard's laughter died in his throat, replaced by an expression of almost physical disgust. Here was everything he despised in one person: poverty, manual labor, careless appearance. Worse still, it was in front of European investors who valued image as much as numbers. But what is this? Richard purposely raised his voice, ensuring everyone in the lobby could hear. How did someone in this state manage to get in here? Michael turned, and at that moment recognized the man who had destroyed his father's company. Richard Montgomery's face was featured in dozens of newspaper articles that Michael had read during the months of unemployment. He was shorter in person than he appeared in photos, but the arrogance was exactly as Michael imagined. "Good afternoon, Mr. Montgomery. I have a 4 o'clock meeting." "A meeting?" Richard burst into laughter, and the sound echoed through the lobby like shattering glass. "You work here as a delivery driver, and now you want to pretend you have important meetings." The investors watched uncomfortably. Morrison in particular frowned. There was something about the young wet man's composure that didn't match the humiliation he was witnessing. "Look at yourself," Richard continued, approaching Michael like a predator circling prey. "Soaked, dirty, carrying that stinking backpack like a vagrant. Do you really think someone like you can be in the same environment as international investors?" Michael remained silent, but something in his brown eyes gleamed. It wasn't fear or shame, but a silent determination that Richard couldn't interpret. This unexpected calm irritated the businessman even more. "I know exactly what you are." Richard raised his voice even higher, turning the humiliation into a public spectacle. "A failed delivery driver who couldn't even stay dry. Probably one of those lazy young people who doesn't want to work properly and keeps dreaming of big opportunities." It was then that Michael spoke, his voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Sir, you don't know me. You know nothing about me. I don't need to know." Richard was enjoying himself now, fed by the nervous laughter of the investors. "Your appearance says everything. Your social position says everything. People like you exist to serve people like me." Richard took a $100 bill from his Bottega Veneta wallet and threw it on the wet floor at Michael's feet. "Take that and get out. It's more than you'll earn today carrying packages for important people." The money floated in the puddle like a physical insult. The entire lobby was silent now. Security guards, receptionists, and even the investors watching the scene with a mixture of fascination and horror. Michael looked at the bill on the floor, then raised his eyes to Richard. "Important people," Michael repeated slowly. "Like someone who buys companies just to demolish them? Like someone who fires 200 families to build another shopping center?" Richard's smile wavered. "How did the delivery driver know about Sanders Engineering?" "Like someone," Michael continued, "who destroyed Sanders Engineering." It was at this moment of growing tension that chance interfered. Michael, disturbed by the mention of his father's company, made a sudden movement to adjust the wet backpack. The rainwater had loosened the main zipper, and with the sudden movement, the backpack opened completely. The contents spilled across the marble floor like an explosion of knowledge. The modified laptop slid several feet. Waterproof folders opened, revealing complex technical diagrams. Miniature prototypes of equipment rolled in different directions, and dozens of documents spread in a semicircle around Michael. "What the hell?" Richard began to speak, but was interrupted by a sound he never expected to hear. Dr. James Morrison had stepped forward and let out an exclamation in English. Good Lord! Are those energy conversion schematics? The British investor knelt on the wet floor, completely ignoring his 3,000-pound Armani suit, and began examining the scattered papers. His eyes moved quickly through the diagrams, recognizing concepts he had searched for throughout his career. "These are revolutionary," Morrison murmured, picking up one of the prototypes. "This is a waste-to-energy conversion system, but the efficiency rates..." He looked at Michael with a completely transformed expression. "Young man, are you Michael Sanders?" Michael knelt and began collecting his documents, but responded clearly. "Yes, I'm Michael Sanders. I have a meeting scheduled with you at 4 o'clock. Good God." Morrison stood slowly, holding one of the technical reports. "You're the Michael Sanders who developed the MRS-7 energy conversion technology. The system we've been looking for 5 years?" The silence in the lobby was deafening now. Richard watched without understanding while the other investors approached, equally intrigued by the documents scattered on the floor. "Dr. Morrison," said one of the German investors, examining another set of papers, "these are international licensing contracts. This young man already has preliminary agreements with companies in, my God, in 12 different countries." Michael finished collecting his prototypes and stood up, facing Richard directly for the first time. His posture had changed completely. No longer the humiliated delivery driver, but a confident inventor before his greatest discovery being finally recognized. "Mr. Montgomery," Michael spoke calmly, "I knew Sanders Engineering very well. It was my father's company, and I continued his work after you destroyed it." Dr. Morrison was quickly flipping through the technical documents, his excitement growing with each page. "Mr. Sanders, your technology represents exactly what our industry needs. A system capable of converting urban waste into clean energy with this efficiency could revolutionize the global energy sector. The projections indicate 300% superior efficiency to current technologies," Michael responded, his voice gaining technical confidence. "With urban-scale implementation, each neighborhood could have energy self-sufficiency based on its own waste." Richard watched the transformation in growing shock. The same investors who minutes before laughed at his jokes now completely ignored his presence, fascinated by the diagrams and explanations of the young man he had publicly humiliated. "Mr. Sanders," Morrison said, "our company has been looking for exactly this solution for years. We're prepared to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in the global development and implementation of this technology." "Hundreds of millions," repeated one of the French investors. "With the licensing contracts I've seen here, we're talking about billions in revenue potential." Michael nodded calmly. "Initial estimates suggest so. But most importantly is the environmental impact. This technology can completely transform urban waste management and energy sustainability of large cities." Richard finally found his voice, but it came out hoarse and uncertain. Wait a moment. This is just a delivery driver. You can't be serious about..." "Mr. Montgomery," Dr. Morrison interrupted him with an icy tone that Richard had never heard directed at him. "I just witnessed you publicly humiliate one of the most promising young inventors I've met in decades. Frankly, I'm questioning whether our company should maintain any kind of commercial relationship with someone who demonstrates such lack of character." The words hit Richard like physical bullets. He looked around and saw all the investors watching him with a mixture of disapproval and disgust. The same expression he himself had directed at Michael minutes before. I didn't know. How could I know that he was what?" Morrison asked dryly. "Intelligent? Talented? Valuable? You judge this young man based solely on his appearance and occupation, demonstrating exactly the type of prejudice that our company refuses to tolerate." Michael observed the scene in silence, showing no satisfaction or revenge, only the sadness of someone who knew all too well this type of situation. He had witnessed the same prejudice against his father for years, and now saw poetic justice unfolding before his eyes. "Dr. Morrison," Michael said calmly, "perhaps we could continue our discussion in a more appropriate environment. I have much more technical documentation I'd like to share." "Of course, Mr. Sanders. And please call me James." Morrison turned to Richard one last time. "Mr. Montgomery, consider all our preliminary contracts canceled. Ecotech Global doesn't do business with people who demonstrate such lack of basic human values. One by one, the other investors followed suit, canceling future meetings and collecting their materials. In less than 15 minutes, the lobby emptied, leaving Richard alone with the employees who had witnessed his complete humiliation. 6 months later, Michael Sanders adjusted his tie knot and observed the panoramic view of the city through the windows of what was formerly Richard Montgomery's office. The 35th floor of what was now called Sanders Innovation Tower had been completely transformed. The ostentatious decorations replaced by state-of-the-art equipment, contemporary art paintings, and a technical library that occupied an entire wall. Michael's transformation wasn't just external. Although the tailored suit and executive haircut were visible evidence of his new position, the real change was in his quiet confidence, in the way he carried his shoulders, in the manner his voice resonated with natural authority when explaining complex technical concepts to international investors. In 6 months, his technology had been licensed for implementation in 15 countries, transforming him into the youngest billionaire in the energy sector. But for Michael, money was just a consequence. The real triumph was in the letters he received weekly from cities where his technology was being implemented. Carbon emissions drastically reduced, entire communities achieving energy self-sufficiency, thousands of jobs created in clean technology sectors. Sanders Innovation wasn't just a company, it had become a movement. Michael had used part of his resources to create a network of technology incubators in peripheral neighborhoods, offering opportunities for young inventors who, like him, possessed talent but not financial resources. On the building's ground floor, where a pretentious art gallery that Richard used to impress visitors once operated, Michael had installed the Michael Sanders Innovation Center, an open space where public school students could access equipped laboratories, mentorship with experienced engineers, and funding to develop their own inventions. The difference between a dream and reality, Michael explained during the center's inauguration, isn't talent or intelligence, it's opportunity. And opportunity is something we can create for each other. The plaque at the center's entrance bore a phrase that became the company's motto, where human potential knows no social limits. While Michael built an empire based on innovation and social responsibility, Richard Montgomery experienced for the first time in decades what it was like to live without the protective mantle of absolute power. The cancellation of European contracts had created a devastating domino effect. Banks reevaluated their credits, suppliers demanded advance payments, and specialized media began questioning the sustainability of his developments. Richard now worked as a real estate consultant in a medium-sized company, far from the days when he commanded an empire of 12 buildings. His current apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in a middle-class neighborhood, was a brutal fall from the 2-story penthouse he once called home. Mornings were the worst, waking up without the army of assistants, without the economic newspapers highlighting his business, without the sensation of absolute control that for so long defined his identity. But the deepest humiliation wasn't financial, it was moral. Richard had been forced to recognize that he had destroyed lives for decades, not out of necessity or justice, but simply because he could. Sanders Engineering was just one among dozens of companies he had crushed without considering human consequences. Now working alongside people who earned modest salaries, Richard began to understand the real value of the lives he had despised. It was a rainy May afternoon, exactly 1 year after the lobby confrontation, when Richard found himself face to face with Michael Sanders again. Richard was leaving a frustrating meeting with clients who had rejected his proposal when he saw the familiar figure approaching on the sidewalk. Michael wore an elegant but discreet overcoat, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Richard's monthly salary. But what most impressed Richard was Michael's expression. There was no petty triumph or vindictive satisfaction, only the serene sadness of someone who intimately knew the weight of consequences. "Mr. Montgomery," Michael greeted him politely, stopping under a cafe awning. "How have you been?" Richard felt the familiar impulse to respond with arrogance, but the words died in his throat. Faced with Michael's genuine dignity, His habitual defenses seemed ridiculously inadequate. "Learning," Richard finally responded, surprising himself with the honesty. "Learning things I should have known long ago." Michael nodded slowly. "My father used to say that the most valuable wisdom usually comes through pain." He wasn't just talking about inventions. "About your company," Richard began, then stopped, searching for the right words. "About Sanders Engineering. I didn't know. Didn't seek to know about the people who were affected. That doesn't justify anything, but—" "Mr. Montgomery," Michael interrupted gently, "hatred is a very heavy burden to carry. My father taught me that true strength comes from building, not destroying." Michael took a business card from his pocket and offered it to Richard. "We're always looking for consultants with experience in real estate development for our sustainable housing projects. If you're interested in using your experience to build something positive." Richard took the card with trembling hands. It was a job offer, but also something much bigger. It was forgiveness, opportunity for redemption, chance to rebuild not just his financial life, but his own soul. "Why?" Richard asked, his voice almost a whisper. "After everything I did." Michael smiled, not the superiority smile that Richard knew so well, but something genuine and warm. "Because everyone deserves a second chance to discover who they really can be. My father believed that people aren't born good or bad. They make choices. Every day we make choices." 2 years later, Richard Montgomery, now Director of Sustainable Development at Sanders Innovation, watched the inauguration ceremony of the Hope Gardens housing complex. 500 low-income families were receiving apartments equipped with Michael's energy technology, guaranteeing not just dignified housing, but also energy self-sufficiency that would drastically reduce their living costs. Richard had supervised every aspect of the construction, applying his decades of real estate experience, but this time with a completely different purpose. Instead of maximizing profits through exploitation, he was maximizing social impact through responsible innovation. At the ceremony, Michael took the improvised stage to speak to the families receiving keys to their new homes. His mother, Mrs. Rosa, was in the front row, tears of pride streaming down her face as she watched the son she had raised alone after her husband's early death. "My father always said that technology only has value when it serves people." Michael spoke into the microphone, his voice echoing through the crowded courtyard. "Today, we're proving that innovation and social justice aren't opposing concepts. They're natural partners." He looked at Richard, who was beside the stage, helping organize the key distribution. "This project was only possible because people with different experiences came together with a common goal. Because we believe that everyone, regardless of origin, appearance, or past history, has something valuable to contribute." After the ceremony, Michael and Richard walked together through the housing complex, observing children playing on solar-powered playgrounds, adults talking animatedly about new jobs created by the technology implementation, elderly people resting on benches under carefully planted trees to create comfortable microclimates. "You know what's most incredible?" Michael commented, stopping in front of a small square where a fountain recycled rainwater through a system he had designed himself. "My father never saw any of his inventions implemented on a large scale. He died believing his ideas could change the world, but without being certain." Richard nodded in silence. He had learned to listen more and speak less in the last 2 years. "Now," Michael continued, "when I look at projects like this, I know he was right. Not just about technology, but about something bigger. The idea that we can build a world where one person's success doesn't need to come at the cost of another's dignity." 5 years after the confrontation in the Montgomery Tower lobby, Sanders Innovation had become one of the world's largest sustainable technology companies, with implementations in 36 countries and more than 50,000 direct jobs created. Michael Sanders, at 33, was regularly cited in lists of young world leaders, but consistently refused invitations to television programs or interviews that focused on his personality instead of his work. The Innovation Center had expanded to 12 units in different American cities, each offering opportunities for young inventors from underprivileged communities. More than 200 projects had received funding and mentorship, creating a new generation of social entrepreneurs who followed the model established by Michael. Profit as a consequence of positive impact, not as the primary objective. Richard Montgomery, at 57, had found a satisfaction he had never experienced during his years as a predatory businessman. His sustainability reports were case studies in universities, demonstrating how business expertise could be applied to solve complex social problems. He still lived in the modest apartment, but now by choice, he had discovered that happiness had no direct correlation with square footage or expensive objects. One sunny November morning, Michael was reviewing projects in his office when his assistant announced an unexpected visit. "Mr. Sanders, there's a young woman here who would like to speak with you. She said she's an inventor and brought some prototypes in her backpack." Michael smiled and asked for her to come in. A girl of approximately 16 entered timidly, carrying a worn school backpack and visibly nervous. Her clothes were simple but clean, and her eyes gleamed with the type of determined intelligence that Michael recognized immediately. "Good afternoon, Mr. Sanders. My name is Ana Silva. I heard about your innovation center and, well, I developed a system that can purify polluted water using solar energy and some recycled materials. I don't have money to patent it, but I thought maybe you could take a look." Michael stood up and gestured to a comfortable chair in front of his desk. "Of course, Ana. But first, can you tell me a little about yourself? How did you develop interest in environmental technology?" Ana opened her backpack and began carefully removing some prototypes made with improvised materials, but demonstrating remarkable ingenuity. "I live in the South Bronx, and our region always has problems with water quality. My grandmother got sick last year because of it, so I started researching ways to clean water without using expensive electricity." As Ana explained her invention, with growing passion, Michael felt a familiar emotion. The same one he had experienced years before when he finally had the opportunity to show his own technology to people who could understand its value. The difference was that now he was on the other side of the table, in the position of power that could transform dreams into reality. "Ana," Michael said after carefully examining the prototypes, "your idea has extraordinary potential. With proper development, it could impact millions of people who don't have access to potable water." The girl's eyes lit up. "Really? Do you really think it can work?" "Not just work, it can revolutionize. How about we start with a full scholarship in our incubator? You'd have access to laboratories, technical mentorship, and resources to develop your invention properly." Ana began to cry, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming joy of someone who had just seen a door open to a future that seemed impossible just an hour before. "Mr. Sanders," she said between tears, "I don't know how to thank you." Michael remembered a rainy afternoon 5 years before, when he himself was on her side of the table, carrying impossible dreams in a wet backpack. "Ana," he said gently, "you're already thanking me. By dedicating your intelligence to solve problems that affect other people, you're proving that it's worth investing in young people like you." Meanwhile, at the Innovation Center, Ana Silva worked late on her water purification prototype, surrounded by other young inventors who had found there the same thing Michael had found years before: opportunity, mentorship, and most importantly, the belief that their ideas could make a real difference in the world. The story would continue repeating infinitely. Talented young people from humble origins discovering they had the power to transform realities. Powerful business people learning that true success was measured by lives improved, not figures accumulated. Entire communities rediscovering that innovation and social justice were natural partners, not opposing concepts. Michael Sanders had proven that a wet delivery driver carrying dreams in an improvised backpack could defeat an empire built on arrogance and contempt. More importantly, he had demonstrated that true victory wasn't in humiliating the opponent, but in transforming the game dynamics so everyone could win. And somewhere in the city, that same night, Another brilliant young person from humble origins closed their eyes, dreaming of inventions that could change the world, not yet knowing they carried within themselves the same transformative potential that had elevated Michael Sanders from despised delivery driver to internationally celebrated visionary. The difference was that now there existed a place where those dreams could become reality. A support network built specifically to ensure that talent wouldn't be wasted for lack of opportunity. And a living example that origin doesn't determine destiny, choices determine, where human potential knows no social limits. The plaque at the Innovation Center's entrance gleamed softly in the night's darkness, illuminating the path for all those who dared believe they could be more than birth circumstances determined. And the story continued, one choice at a time, one opportunity at a time, one transformed life at a time. Because some stories don't end, they multiply infinitely, creating waves of change that expand far beyond their original protagonists, touching lives that will never know where the initial inspiration to believe that change was possible came from. Michael Sanders had begun as a delivery driver carrying a backpack of impossible dreams. He had become a catalyst for social transformation, who definitively proved that the world's most revolutionary power is humanity's capacity to choose to be better than circumstances allow, and to use that choice to create similar opportunities for others. And so, the story truly began.